Episode 1. Arrival in Shadow Bay. The coastal wind howled, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo across the empty docks. Maya Reynolds tightened her scarf around her neck, shivering as she took in the bleak sight of Shadow Bay. The town, nestled against steep cliffs and overlooking an ocean that was as dark as ink, felt strangely frozen in time. This was no ordinary town. Maya could feel it as soon as she stepped off the bus. The people here, few and silent, watched her with wary eyes, and their faces held an expression she couldn't quite place. Not hostility, exactly, but a caution that bordered on fear. Shadow Bay had become a recent fascination for her, especially after hearing about the unexplained disappearance of a local girl. Her editor had barely listened before waving her off, saying the story wouldn't sell. But Maya was nothing if not persistent. She'd come anyway, determined to uncover what she sensed was an untold story waiting to be revealed. The air was thick with salt and something else, something almost metallic. As she made her way to the only inn in town, she noticed that none of the other buildings showed any lights. The streets were lined with old, sagging houses, their windows dark, as if the town itself had been asleep for years. In the distance, perched on a cliff's edge, stood a towering lighthouse, its pale white structure stark against the dull sky. Even from afar, it seemed to be watching her, almost like a sentinel. The inn, the Tide's Rest, was a quaint, creaky building with peeling paint and an old-fashioned charm. Inside, she found herself face to face with the innkeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Perkins, who seemed as ancient as the town itself. "Evening," Mrs. Perkins greeted, her voice a gravelly whisper. Her eyes flitted over Maya, assessing her. "You're here for work?" "Yes, I'm a journalist," Maya replied, trying to keep her tone casual, though she could see Mrs. Perkins's face tighten at the mention. "I'm interested in writing about the town. I heard strange stories." Mrs. Perkins's expression hardened. "Strange stories, There are enough of those. But most of us prefer to leave the past where it belongs. You do well to remember that, dear." Maya nodded, though her curiosity only grew. "I'll keep that in mind." After checking in, she headed up to her room, her suitcase bumping against each step as the wood creaked beneath her feet. Her room was small, with a view of the cliffs and, in the distance, the lighthouse. She set down her suitcase, turning to look out the window, where the lighthouse's light cut through the foggy night. As she was about to turn away, a figure caught her eye. A man stood at the edge of the cliff, near the lighthouse. He was tall, his coat flapping in the wind, and he seemed to be staring out at the water, completely unmoving. The sight unsettled her. A lone figure on the cliffs, surrounded by nothing but the roaring sea. The next morning, Maya set out to explore the town, hoping to get her bearings and maybe find someone willing to talk. Her first stop was the town's tiny cafe, a dimly lit place called the Driftwood. Inside, the few patrons fell silent as she entered, their gazes quickly shifting to their coffee mugs. She ignored the stares and approached the counter, where a young waitress eyed her warily. "Morning," Maya greeted. "I'm new in town. Just wanted to get a feel for the place." The waitress shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Not much to see. It's just quiet here." Maya noticed a newspaper on a nearby table. The headline caught her eye: "Disappearance Marks 10th in Shadow Bay's History." She picked it up, skimming through the brief article about a girl named Lila Moore, who had vanished a month ago. It was frustratingly vague, with only a few sentences about how she was last seen near the lighthouse. "Lila Moore," Maya muttered. "She's the one who disappeared, right?" The waitress tensed, glancing around before nodding. "People say the lighthouse has something to do with it." Maya's pulse quickened. "How so?" Before the waitress could answer, the door creaked open, and a tall figure entered. Maya recognized him instantly. It was the man she'd seen standing on the cliffs. He looked around, his gaze settling on her with an intensity that made her shiver. His eyes were cold, piercing, as if they could see right through her. "You're the new girl," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. Maya raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Samuel Finch, lighthouse keeper." She extended a hand, but he merely stared at it, not moving. Unfazed, she lowered her hand, meeting his gaze head-on. I'm Maya. I'm here to write about the town. People don't come here to write, he said, almost as if it were a warning. And people who try to learn too much tend to leave quickly. His words sent a chill down her spine, but she managed a steady voice. I'm not most people, Mr. Finch. I'm here to stay. Samuel's eyes narrowed. Then remember this. The past has a way of swallowing people whole. Leave the lighthouse alone. Some things are best left in the dark. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Maya with a feeling that was half dread, half fascination. She knew then that Samuel Finch was not only her first lead, but perhaps the key to the town's mysteries. That night, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, Maya found herself drawn toward the lighthouse. The path was steep and winding, lined with stones that gleamed under the moonlight. She moved slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The closer she got, the colder the air became, as if the lighthouse exuded a chill of its own. Finally, she reached the base of the structure. The door was old, its wood splintered, as if no one had touched it in years. Yet, when she reached out, she found it unlocked. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the empty path behind her. Every instinct told her to turn back, but she pushed forward, her hand pressing the door open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. She stepped cautiously, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Symbols were carved into the walls, ancient symbols that looked oddly familiar, as if they'd been pulled from the depths of her memory. And then she heard it, a low, humming sound, almost like a whisper, calling her deeper into the tower. A sudden crash echoed from above, and Maya froze. She wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. There was no response. She took a few steps back, her heart racing, when a shadow moved across the wall. It was tall, thin, and seemed to stretch impossibly high, merging with the darkness. Panicking, she turned and rushed back out of the lighthouse, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't stop running until she reached the inn, slamming her door behind her. As she stood there, heart pounding, she looked back out the window, back to the lighthouse on the cliff. The shadow was gone, but something had changed in her. She felt a connection, a strange, inexplicable pull that told her she was no longer just an outsider in Shadow Bay. Whatever secrets the lighthouse held, she was now part of them. Episode 2. The First Clues. The early morning mist clung to Shadow Bay like a damp veil, making everything seem muted and distant. Maya hadn't slept well, haunted by images of the dark lighthouse and the unsettling shadow that had appeared from nowhere. But even her fear couldn't compete with her curiosity. She was certain now. Something lay hidden in this town, and she was determined to uncover it. After a quick breakfast, Maya decided to visit the local library, hoping to find any records that could shed light on the town's history. The library was tucked away in a small, unassuming building at the edge of the main square. Inside, the smell of old paper and dust greeted her, comforting in its familiarity. As she browsed the shelves, Maya's attention was drawn to a heavy, leather-bound book titled Legends of Shadow Bay. She pulled it out and flipped through its yellowed pages, pausing at an entry about the lighthouse. "The Guardian of Shadows," she read aloud softly. "It is said that the lighthouse keeper serves as a protector, a guardian between our world and something far older and darker." A chill ran down her spine. She remembered Samuel's warning about leaving the lighthouse alone. Could he really be involved in something supernatural? Shaking off the thought, Maya continued to read. The legend spoke of a watcher who protected the town but also held a terrible power, one that demanded loyalty and sacrifice. As Maya tried to absorb the strange story, a quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "Interesting, isn't it?" Maya looked up to see a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, her expression skeptical but curious. The woman wore a worn cardigan and held a book close to her chest. "I'm Emma Gray, the town's historian," she introduced herself, her voice tinged with suspicion. "You're Maya, the journalist, right?" "Yes," Maya replied, feeling a mix of relief and caution. "I was hoping to find someone who could tell me more about the town's unique history." Emma's eyes narrowed. Most people don't bother looking too closely at Shadow Bay's past. Some things are best left alone, you know? But why? Maya pressed. There are strange occurrences here. Disappearances, superstitions, and a lighthouse that no one seems to want to talk about. Don't you think people deserve to know the truth? Emma hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were alone before she spoke. The truth is, Maya, people in Shadow Bay aren't just superstitious. They're afraid. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the lighthouse and the strange shadows that linger there. She claimed there was an ancient power in the bay, a power that took people if they got too close to it. Maya's heart raced. What kind of power? No one knows for sure, Emma said, lowering her voice. But people have vanished from this town for as long as anyone can remember. Each time, they were last seen by the lighthouse. And each time, the town tried to forget. Before Maya could ask more, the librarian interrupted them, giving a nervous glance toward the door. Ms. Gray, perhaps it's best not to fill the young lady's head with stories. Emma pursed her lips, clearly annoyed. Fine, she muttered, casting one last glance at Maya. But if you're really intent on this, come by my house tonight. I have some things to show you. Maya agreed, feeling both excited and uneasy. As Emma walked away, she noticed the librarian giving her a disapproving look, as if to warn her to drop her investigation. But Maya had no intention of stopping. That evening, as the sky darkened to a smoky blue, Maya made her way to Emma's small cottage on the outskirts of town. The house was cluttered with old books, maps, and various trinkets that spoke of Emma's love for history. She welcomed Maya with a tight smile, gesturing for her to sit by a crackling fireplace. Emma pulled out a stack of photographs, spreading them across the table. These are from my family's collection, she explained. My grandmother took these. She was obsessed with the lighthouse and whatever lay beyond it. Maya leaned in, studying the faded images. They were black and white, showing the cliffs, the lighthouse, something strange. In the corner of several photos, there was a shadowy figure, almost imperceptible, standing at the edge of the cliff. These photos were taken over 70 years ago, Emma said, her voice low. But look at the figure. It's the same shape, the same presence. My grandmother believed it was the Watcher, or perhaps even the shadow itself. Maya's pulse quickened as she took in the dark figure. It looked eerily similar to the shadow she'd seen the night before. Do you think this has anything to do with the disappearances? Emma sighed. I don't know, Maya, but I do know that the town has always turned a blind eye to anything that involves the lighthouse. They're too afraid. People say that the shadow calls out to certain individuals, drawing them to the cliffs. Maya swallowed, feeling the weight of Emma's words. Have you ever seen it? Emma's face grew tense. Once, when I was young, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But as I got older, I realized that whatever I saw wasn't just my imagination. And when I heard that you'd come to investigate, I knew you would see it too. That shadow, it's no ordinary darkness. It's something ancient, something that's been here long before any of us. Suddenly, a loud creak sounded from the hallway, startling them both. Emma rose, her face pale, as they both strained to listen. But the noise faded, leaving only the crackling of the fire. You should go, Emma said abruptly, her tone uneasy. It's not safe to linger here at night. Maya hesitated, but eventually nodded, gathering her things and thanking Emma for her time. As she stepped out into the night, she felt the weight of the darkness pressing in on her. Every shadow seemed to move, and every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. She made her way back toward the inn, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following her. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder only to see an empty street. But just as she reached the inn's door, she caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the town square, watching her. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, and motionless. Maya froze, her heart pounding, but as soon as she blinked, the figure was gone. Shaken, she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. As she leaned against the door, trying to calm her nerves, she realized that the shadow wasn't just part of the town's lore. It was real, and somehow it had noticed her. The night stretched on, but Maya couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, replaying Emma's words and the figure she'd seen in the square. The town's secrets were beginning to unravel, and she was caught right in the center of it all. But one question haunted her above all others. What did the shadow want with her? Episode 3, Dark Secrets of the Lighthouse. The next day dawned gray and cold, casting a pall over Shadow Bay. Maya woke up exhausted, her mind still racing from the previous night's encounter. She tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread as she made her way to the cliffside path leading to the lighthouse. She knew she was getting closer to the truth, and the pull of the lighthouse was undeniable. When she reached the top of the cliff, the lighthouse loomed before her, tall and imposing against the sky. The mist clung to its sides, giving it an almost ghostly appearance. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and pushed the door open. Inside, the lighthouse felt even colder than the outside air, and the shadows clung thickly to the walls. Maya took out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the winding staircase that spiraled up to the top. She noticed again the strange symbols carved into the walls, each one more cryptic than the last. They looked almost like runes, twisting and overlapping as if they were alive. As she climbed, her footsteps echoed eerily. The higher she went, the more she felt as if the lighthouse were closing in on her, each step pressing down with a strange, unseen weight. Finally, she reached the top, finding herself in the circular observation room. Here, the glass windows offered a full view of the churning ocean below, dark and unforgiving. The room was empty, save for an old wooden chair and a small table with a single, dust-covered book resting on it. She approached the table, her eyes narrowing as she took in the book's title, The Watcher's Log. Carefully, she opened it, flipping through pages filled with notes in a cramped, shaky handwriting. Each entry documented sightings of the shadowy figure and described strange occurrences, the same humming sound she'd heard, figures seen only from the corner of the eye, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The final entry sent a shiver through her. The shadow grows restless. It calls to those who are marked, and it will not be denied. Tonight, another sacrifice must be made to keep it at bay. Suddenly, she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Her heart pounded as she turned to see Samuel Finch enter, his face unreadable. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze flicking from the book in her hands to her face. "You couldn't stay away, could you?" he said quietly. Maya swallowed, feeling a mixture of fear and defiance. "What's going on here, Samuel? What is this shadow? And what does it want?" He stepped closer, his expression darkening. "Some questions don't have answers you want to hear, Maya. The shadow has been here long before any of us. It's bound to this place, connected to the lighthouse. Every generation, it calls for one of us, a watcher, to keep it contained. But the price..." His voice trailed off, his face twisting with an emotion Maya couldn't place. "What price?" Maya pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked away, his eyes distant. The shadow demands a life every few years. It chooses its own, and when it does, there's no escaping it. The town knows, though they pretend to forget. They're too afraid to fight it. Maya took a step back, her mind racing. "So you're saying people have been sacrificed?" He met her gaze, his face expressionless. "It's not something I'm proud of, but if the shadow isn't appeased, it grows stronger. The disappearances, they're not random. The shadow picks its victims." The horror of his words sank in. "And you let this happen?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "It's not as simple as you think. I was born into this, just like my father before me. I tried to keep people away, to keep the shadow calm. But sometimes, it can't be stopped." Maya took a shaky breath, anger and disbelief mingling within her. "And you think that justifies what you've done?" Samuel didn't answer, only turned his gaze out the window. "I don't expect you to understand, but you need to leave. The shadow, it's already noticed you, Maya. I've seen it." Maya stared at him, her resolve hardening. "I'm not leaving. Not until I get answers. There has to be another way." Samuel's expression softened, almost sad. "If there is, it's buried with the past. But suit yourself. Just know that the closer you get, the more you'll be putting yourself in danger." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Maya alone in the lighthouse. She looked back at the book, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the final pages. Each entry painted a darker picture, detailing the price each watcher paid to keep the shadow at bay. Determined, she pocketed the book, vowing to study it in detail. As she descended the lighthouse, a thought struck her. Emma. She might have more answers. Maya headed back down the cliffside path, the wind whipping around her as if the very air sought to push her back. She reached Emma's house just as dusk settled over the town, casting long shadows over the narrow streets. Emma opened the door before Maya even knocked, her face a mixture of surprise and concern. "I was hoping you'd come back," Emma said, motioning her inside. Maya sat down, pulling the watcher's log from her bag and setting it on the table. "Samuel told me about the shadow. About the sacrifices." Emma's face darkened. "I warned you this was dangerous. The shadow is an ancient thing, tied to this town in ways none of us fully understand. But why the sacrifices? Why does it need people?" Emma sighed, her hands wringing together. "The shadow feeds on life, on energy. It's bound to this place, but if it doesn't get what it wants, it'll spread, consume. The sacrifices keep it contained. It's a terrible pact, but one the town has followed for generations." Maya's mind raced, her thoughts flashing to the list of disappearances in the newspaper, to the photos of the shadowy figure. There has to be a way to break this, to stop it. Emma looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps, but no one's ever dared to try. The shadow is powerful, Maya, and if you try to defy it, it'll come for you too." Despite Emma's warning, Maya felt a glimmer of determination. She wouldn't let this town be haunted forever by some dark force. She would find a way to stop it. As she left Emma's house, Maya felt the weight of the shadow all around her. She glanced up at the lighthouse on the cliff, its light spinning slowly, cutting through the night. The shadow was waiting, and she could feel its presence like a cold hand on her shoulder, a whisper in her ear. But Maya wasn't afraid, not anymore. She was ready to face whatever lay in the darkness. Episode 4, Shadowy Figures. The days passed in a haze of fog and quiet tension. Maya spent most of her time poring over the watcher's log and her own scattered notes, piecing together the unsettling puzzle of Shadow Bay. But every time she thought she was getting closer to an answer, the pieces seemed to shift, leaving her feeling more lost than before. One evening, as she sat alone in her room at the tide's rest, a sudden, suffocating silence descended over the town. The usual sounds of the night, the creaking of the inn, the wind rattling the windows, were absent, leaving only a heavy, oppressive quiet. It felt as if the town itself were holding its breath. She was about to close her notebook when she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, like a voice carried by the wind. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, sending a chill down her spine. "Maya." The whisper was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she looked around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But she was alone. "Maya," the voice called again, drawing her toward the window. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. She moved slowly to the glass, peering out into the night. The streets below were empty, bathed in an eerie, dim light cast by the lone street lamp outside the inn. But then, her heart skipped a beat. Standing just beyond the lamp's glow was a figure cloaked in shadow, tall and thin, its form almost blending with the darkness around it. She couldn't make out a face or any defining features, only a pair of eyes that seemed to glint with a cold, unnatural light. She blinked, and the figure was gone. The sense of dread lingered, gnawing at her as she backed away from the window. She didn't sleep that night. The image of those glinting eyes burned into her mind. The following morning, Maya was exhausted, but the strange encounter had only fueled her determination to keep digging. She met with Emma, who looked at her with concern. "You look like you haven't slept," Emma observed, her expression sympathetic but wary. "I haven't," Maya admitted. Something was outside my window last night. I don't know if it was the shadow or just my imagination, but I swear, I felt it watching me." Emma's face grew pale, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her cup of tea. "It's getting closer. The shadow, once it notices you, it won't let go. It's drawn to those who look too closely." Maya swallowed, her resolve hardening. Then I need to stop it before it can do anything worse. Emma glanced around, as if the walls themselves might be listening. There are stories, ancient stories, about ways to weaken the shadow. My grandmother believed the lighthouse was built as a way to keep it contained, to trap it within the cliffs and the sea. But the power to hold it back is weakening. The last ritual was performed decades ago. Ritual? Maya echoed, her curiosity piqued. What kind of ritual? Emma's gaze grew distant, her voice barely above a whisper. A ritual of binding. The watcher has to offer something personal, something deeply connected to them. It's a way to satisfy the shadow without the need for a life. But no one has attempted it since then. Maya felt a surge of hope, tempered by doubt. Do you think it would work? Emma's eyes filled with an old sorrow. I don't know, but it might be our only chance. That night, Maya found herself once again drawn to the lighthouse. The path was deserted, and the wind seemed colder, more hostile. She could almost feel the shadow's presence lurking just beyond the edges of her vision, watching, waiting. When she reached the lighthouse, she climbed the winding staircase, each step echoing through the narrow stone walls. As she reached the top, she noticed a strange glow emanating from a corner of the room. There, etched into the floor, were the same symbols she had seen before, but now they seemed to shimmer faintly, as if charged with some unseen energy. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the room filled with a faint, humming sound, the same one she'd heard before. She turned slowly, her flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. And then she saw it. The shadowy figure from her nightmare was there, standing just a few feet away. This time, its form was clearer, more defined, with hollow eyes that glinted like shards of ice. It radiated a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to seep into her bones, chilling her to the core. Paralyzed, Maya could only stare as the figure began to move, gliding silently toward her. Its face was a void, a dark expanse where features should have been, and yet she could feel its gaze piercing into her. "Why are you here?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond, but in her mind, she heard a voice. Not a voice exactly, but a series of thoughts, ancient and primal, echoing within her. "You are marked, chosen, bound to me, as all those before you." Maya's heart raced, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. "I'm not bound to anyone. I came here to stop you." A low, chilling laugh echoed in her mind, sending a fresh wave of terror through her. "There is no escape, Maya. I am as old as the sea, as unyielding as the tides. You cannot fight what you cannot understand." Desperation flared within her, and she took a step back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "I'll find a way to stop you. I won't be your next victim." The shadow seemed to regard her with amusement, its form shifting, growing darker. "Then let us see, Maya. Let us see if you can endure." With that, the figure dissolved, vanishing into the darkness. Maya collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her. She stumbled back down the stairs, her mind racing. The shadow was no mere legend. It was real, powerful, and relentless. And now it had marked her. When she reached the inn, Mrs. Perkins was waiting for her, a knowing look in her eyes. "The shadow doesn't take kindly to those who pry," she said softly. "If you're wise, you'll leave this town before it's too late." But Maya shook her head, her determination unbroken. "I'm not leaving. Not until I've found a way to stop this." Mrs. Perkins sighed, her expression resigned. "Then may you find what you're looking for, child, and may it not consume you." As Maya climbed the stairs to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was with her, lurking in every corner, watching her every move. She knew now that there was no turning back. She was bound to this town, to this darkness, and to the secrets that lay buried within the lighthouse. And somehow, she knew that the only way out was through the darkness itself. Episode 5, The Sacrifice. Maya's heart raced as she thumbed through the Watcher's log and her notes, searching for anything about the ritual Emma had described. Despite the fear pressing down on her, she knew that if she didn't act soon, the shadow would continue its deadly cycle. and she might be next. The journal's cryptic notes on the ritual were few, but what she found was chilling. The ceremony required an offering, a piece of oneself, something deeply personal. It was a binding ritual, designed to trap the shadow within the lighthouse and keep it from spreading its influence throughout the town. Determined, Maya set out to meet with Emma again, hoping she could shed light on the ritual specifics. She found Emma pacing in her living room, a stack of ancient books spread across the table. "I knew you'd come," Emma said, her eyes shadowed. "You're here to ask about the ritual, aren't you?" Maya nodded, her face resolute. "If it's the only way to keep the shadow at bay, then I'll do it. I just need to know how." Emma sighed, looking both relieved and troubled. "It's dangerous, Maya. The ritual isn't meant for outsiders. It's meant for those with roots in Shadow Bay, those who have a connection to this place. Without that bond, the ritual could fail." Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't have roots here, but I won't sit back and let this thing keep taking people. If I don't try, more lives will be lost." Emma regarded her with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "Very well, but be warned, Maya. The shadow doesn't give up its hold easily. The ritual requires more than just an offering. You must face your darkest fears, allow it to see into your soul. Only then will it bind itself to the lighthouse and leave the town alone for now." Maya's resolve only hardened. "I'll do it. Tell me what I need to do." Emma opened a dusty, leather-bound book, pointing to a page filled with complex symbols and instructions. "The ritual must be performed at the lighthouse, at the stroke of midnight. You'll need to create a circle of protection using these symbols, and inside it, place an item that's deeply connected to you." Maya's mind flashed to the old locket she'd inherited from her mother. A small, simple thing, but it was the last keepsake she had from her family. She felt a pang of hesitation but quickly pushed it aside. The sacrifice was necessary. As midnight approached, Maya made her way to the lighthouse, clutching the locket tightly in her hand. The town was silent, the wind still, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. The lighthouse loomed above her, its darkened walls blending with the night, and for a brief moment, Maya felt a shiver of doubt. But she couldn't turn back now. Inside, she laid out the symbols Emma had given her, forming a protective circle on the floor. Her hands shook as she placed the locket at the center, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Then, as the clock struck midnight, she began to recite the incantation from the Watcher's log, her voice echoing off the cold stone walls. She could feel the air growing colder, the darkness around her thickening as the shadows stirred. Suddenly, the room filled with a low, resonant hum. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse, and Maya felt a strange pull, as if something was reaching out to her from the depths of the lighthouse. The shadows along the walls began to move, swirling and coalescing into a familiar shape. The shadow's form took shape before her, its empty eyes gleaming with malice. "Why do you seek to bind me, Maya?" The voice echoed in her mind, cold and unyielding. Maya's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "You've taken too much from this town. I won't let you continue." The shadow laughed, a sound that grated against her mind. "I take only what is offered. The town has fed me willingly. And you, Maya, you too, are here to offer yourself." She felt an icy grip on her heart, the words sinking in like a blade. "No," she whispered. "I'm here to stop you." "You cannot stop what you do not understand," the shadow replied, its form darkening. "You are a child lost in the dark, trying to wield powers beyond your grasp." Maya felt a rush of anger, defiance flaring in her chest. "Maybe I don't understand everything, but I know one thing. I won't let you take any more lives." She raised the locket, its simple design glinting in the dim light. She closed her eyes, willing all her memories, her emotions, into the small object, the last connection she had to her past, her family. She spoke the final words of the ritual, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The shadow's laughter faded, replaced by a chilling silence. Maya opened her eyes to see the shadow frozen, its form flickering, as if caught between the realms of light and dark. It let out a low, guttural sound, and for a brief moment, She felt its cold presence flood her mind, revealing flashes of her worst fears, her deepest insecurities. The pain was excruciating, but she held firm, focusing on the locket, on the memories it held. Slowly, she felt the shadow's grip loosening, the darkness receding as the ritual took hold. The room seemed to exhale, the weight lifting as the shadow's form dissolved into the floor, leaving only a faint, dark mark in the center of the circle. The hum faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Maya collapsed, gasping for breath, her body weak from the ordeal. She clutched the locket, feeling a deep sadness wash over her. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. The locket felt lighter, emptier, as if it had absorbed a piece of her soul in the process. She stumbled out of the lighthouse, the cool night air filling her lungs as she looked up at the stars. For the first time in days, she felt a strange sense of peace. The shadow had been bound, its hold on the town weakened. But as she looked back at the lighthouse, she knew that this was not the end. The town was safe, for now, but the shadow was still there, lurking within the walls of the lighthouse, waiting for its next opportunity. And Maya knew that as long as it existed, Shadow Bay would never be truly free. As she made her way back to the inn, exhausted but relieved, she allowed herself to hope. She had won this battle, but the war against the shadow had only just begun. Episode 6, A Twist of Fate. Maya awoke the next morning with a lingering ache that pulsed through her body. The ritual had taken more out of her than she realized. She clutched her mother's locket, feeling its cold metal pressing against her palm. Although she'd completed the ritual, something about the night felt unfinished. The shadow may have been contained, but she sensed it was only temporary, a mere pause in an ongoing battle. Determined to understand more, she decided to visit Emma again. Perhaps the historian could help her make sense of the lingering questions about the ritual, the lighthouse, and the connection that seemed to bind her so intimately to Shadow Bay. Emma greeted her at the door, her face marked with a strange combination of relief and fear. "I heard what you did last night," she said in a hushed tone. "You bound it, didn't you?" Maya nodded. "For now, at least. But I still don't understand why I feel so connected to all of this. It's like the shadow recognizes me, like it's waiting for something." Emma hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. She led Maya inside, gesturing for her to sit. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, something I only recently discovered myself," she said, her voice heavy. "When I went through the town's old records last night, I found something about your family." Maya's heart raced, her mind spinning with anticipation and dread. "My family?" Emma nodded, reaching for a dusty old ledger and flipping through its brittle pages. She turned the book toward Maya, pointing to a yellowed newspaper clipping. The article was dated nearly a century ago, and the headline sent a chill down Maya's spine. "Mysterious Disappearance of Amelia Reynolds, Last Seen at Shadow Bay Lighthouse." Maya's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photograph beside the headline. A young woman with dark hair and a determined look in her eyes. Eyes that looked eerily similar to her own. That's my great-grandmother," Maya whispered, the words barely audible. "She disappeared?" Emma nodded grimly. "It was never resolved. She was one of the first documented disappearances connected to the lighthouse. According to the records, Amelia Reynolds was deeply interested in the town's mysteries, particularly the legend of the shadow. Some believed she was trying to break the curse, while others thought she was drawn to it, called, in a way, like you." Maya sat back, her mind reeling. All this time, she thought she'd come to Shadow Bay by chance, but it seemed fate had other plans. Her family's bloodline was somehow connected to the curse. The shadow had marked her great-grandmother, and now it had marked her. "There's more," Emma continued, her voice cautious. "The town's archives mention a journal that belonged to Amelia. It was lost over the years, but some believe it contains details about her last days, her plans, and possibly her connection to the shadow." Maya's pulse quickened. If she could find her great-grandmother's journal, maybe she'd finally have the answers she was searching for. "Do you know where it might be?" Emma hesitated, her eyes flickering to the floor. "Some say it's hidden within the lighthouse, though no one's ever found it." Others believe it was taken by the town's elders after her disappearance and buried somewhere in the cliffs. Despite the risks, Maya knew she had to find that journal. It was her only chance to understand her family's connection to the shadow and perhaps find a way to end the curse for good. That night, Maya made her way to the cliffs with a flashlight in hand, the wind howling around her as if warning her to turn back. She walked along the rocky shoreline, her eyes scanning every crevice and outcropping, hoping for a glimmer of something, anything, that might point her in the right direction. Hours passed, and her hope began to wane. Just as she was about to turn back, her flashlight caught the edge of something half buried in the dirt, hidden beneath a cluster of rocks. Heart pounding, she knelt down, brushing away the dirt until she uncovered a small, weathered box. The wood was cracked and splintered, but it was intact. With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside was an old leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The initials AR were embossed on the cover. Maya's breath caught. It was her great-grandmother's journal. She opened it carefully, the fragile pages crackling as she turned to the first entry. June 2, 1927. I have come to Shadow Bay to discover the truth about the lighthouse and the dark force that haunts this town. The people here live in fear, yet they refuse to speak of the creature that lingers at the edge of the cliffs, waiting. They say I am drawn to it because of my blood, because my family has always walked in shadows. But I do not fear it. I am determined to break the curse and free this town from its grip. Maya's hands shook as she read the words, feeling an eerie sense of connection. Her great-grandmother had been just like her, determined to uncover the truth and save the town. She continued reading, the entries growing darker, more frantic. Amelia described her encounters with the shadow, the strange whispers in the night, the way it seemed to call to her, drawing her closer to the lighthouse. And then, in the final entry, the words took on a desperate tone. July 15, 1927. I have discovered the ritual. The shadow can be bound, but only by someone who shares its mark, someone from my bloodline. I fear that I am the one it has chosen, that my blood is the key to its release or its prison. Tonight, I will go to the lighthouse to confront it. If I do not return, let this journal be a warning to my descendants. Beware the shadow. Once it marks you, it will never let you go. Maya closed the journal, her heart racing. Her great-grandmother had tried to bind the shadow but had disappeared in the process. The ritual she'd attempted must have failed, or perhaps it was incomplete. And now, generations later, the shadow had marked her too, drawing her to Shadow Bay just as it had drawn Amelia. As she stood there, the reality of her situation set in. She was tied to the curse of Shadow Bay, bound by blood and fate to the shadow. But unlike her great-grandmother, she would find a way to end it. With renewed determination, Maya returned to the lighthouse, the journal clutched in her hands. The night was dark, the wind howling as she climbed the cliff path, her footsteps echoing against the rocks. She felt the shadow's presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on her, as if it were watching, waiting for her to arrive. Inside the lighthouse, she opened the journal again, studying the last entry. Amelia had discovered a ritual, one that required a direct confrontation with the shadow. But there was a missing piece, something Amelia hadn't written down or hadn't discovered in time. Maya knew that if she wanted to complete her great-grandmother's work, she would have to face the shadow directly. She couldn't just bind it. She would need to destroy it. Taking a deep breath, she spoke into the darkness, her voice strong and unwavering. I know you're here. I know you've marked me, but I'm not afraid of you. I'm here to end this, once and for all. The room grew colder, and she felt a familiar, suffocating presence surround her. The shadow's form took shape before her, dark and looming, its empty eyes staring back at her with a malevolent intensity. You are bound by blood, Maya, the shadow's voice echoed in her mind. You cannot escape. Your great-grandmother tried and failed, and now you are mine. Maya clenched her fists, meeting the shadow's gaze with fierce determination. You're wrong. My great-grandmother may have failed, but I won't. I'm ending this curse, even if it costs me everything. The shadow's laughter filled the room, cold and merciless. Then come, Maya. Face me if you dare. With her great-grandmother's journal as her guide, Maya prepared herself for the final confrontation. The shadow was waiting, and she knew that her fate, and the fate of Shadow Bay, hung in the balance. Episode 7. The Shadow's Call. The walls of the lighthouse pressed in around Maya as she prepared herself to confront the shadow. The journal lay open before her, its brittle pages detailing the fragmented steps of the ritual her great-grandmother had tried and failed to complete. She read Amelia's notes over and over, piecing together the instructions, knowing this might be her only chance to end the curse that had plagued Shadow Bay for generations. The ritual required more than just words and symbols. It demanded a final offering, one that would bind the shadow, not merely to the lighthouse but to a spirit strong enough to contain it. Amelia had believed that only someone who shared the shadow's mark, a bloodline link, could complete the ritual. Maya clenched her fists, feeling the weight of this legacy, the burden her great-grandmother had left behind. But unlike Amelia, Maya was determined to see this through. As midnight approached, she arranged the ritual symbols around the room, forming a circle in the center of the lighthouse's floor. The cold air grew denser, pressing down on her, and she knew the shadow was watching, waiting for her next move. She knelt in the center of the circle, holding the locket she'd inherited from her mother, her last connection to her family, to the life she'd left behind. This locket had been her mother's, and before that, Amelia's, a tangible piece of her lineage. She took a deep breath, whispering a final prayer to the ancestors she hoped were watching over her. Then, she began to chant the ritual words from the journal, her voice steady and clear. Each word felt like it was pulling her deeper into a trance, binding her to the symbols around her and drawing the shadow closer. The air grew colder, and a thick, unnatural darkness filled the room. The shadow's form took shape, looming above her with eyes that glinted like shards of ice. Its voice filled her mind, a low, echoing rumble. "You think you can bind me, child?" the shadow taunted. "Your blood is marked. You are mine, as was she before you." Maya gritted her teeth, meeting the shadow's gaze. "I know who you are. I know what you've taken from this town, from my family, and I'm here to end it. You will take no more lives." The shadow laughed, a chilling sound that reverberated through the lighthouse. "You are a fool, Maya. I am beyond your reach, beyond your power." With a surge of anger, Maya held up the locket, her voice filled with defiance. "This is my family's legacy, and I'll give everything I have to stop you." She began the final chant, her voice rising above the shadow's laughter. The locket glowed in her hand, a faint light that grew stronger as she poured all her memories, all her strength, into it. She thought of her mother, her great-grandmother, and all those who had come before her, those who had tried to defy the shadow and failed. This was their moment, their last stand. The shadow recoiled, hissing as the light from the locket expanded, filling the room with a warm, golden glow. Maya felt its cold presence invading her mind, clawing at her memories, her fears. It showed her images of her past, moments of doubt and pain, as if trying to weaken her resolve. But she stood firm, pushing back against the darkness with all the strength she could muster. She focused on the faces of her family, on the legacy they'd left her. This curse might have claimed them, but it wouldn't claim her. As she chanted the final words, she felt a searing pain in her chest, as if something were being pulled from her very soul. Her vision blurred, but she pressed on, holding onto the locket as her connection to her family, to her past, to everything that mattered. The shadow let out a furious scream, its form shifting and writhing as it was drawn into the circle. The darkness grew denser, pressing in on her, suffocating, until finally, with a blinding flash of light, it collapsed into the locket, vanishing into its depths. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya collapsed to the floor, her body weak and trembling, her vision fading in and out. She clutched the locket, feeling its warmth, but also sensing that something had changed. It felt heavier, darker, as if it had absorbed part of the shadow's essence. She lay there, gasping for breath, the weight of the locket pressing against her chest. The ritual was complete. The shadow was bound, sealed within the locket, and she knew it would no longer haunt Shadow Bay, but at a cost. As she slowly got to her feet, The reality of her sacrifice settled in. She could feel the darkness within the locket, a constant presence that lingered at the edge of her mind. The shadow had left its mark on her, and she knew it would always be a part of her now, a reminder of what she'd fought to save. She staggered out of the lighthouse, the cold night air filling her lungs as she looked up at the stars. The curse was broken, but she was bound to the shadow now, her family's legacy forever entwined with the darkness she'd conquered. As she made her way back to the town, she felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that Shadow Bay was finally free. The townspeople would be safe, and her great-grandmother's spirit could rest. But as she clutched the locket, she knew her journey wasn't over. The shadow was quiet, contained, but she could feel it stirring, a dark whisper that echoed in the back of her mind. Shadow Bay would no longer live in fear. But for Maya, the battle was far from over. The shadow had become a part of her, and she would carry it with her always, a reminder of the darkness she had faced and the strength she had found within. Episode 8: Descent into Darkness. The days following the ritual passed in a strange blur. Maya tried to slip back into the routines of life, to pick up where she'd left off before coming to Shadow Bay, but she found herself unable to shake the feeling of someone, watching her. Even the simplest activities, like walking down the street or reading a book, felt strange, distant, as if a part of her were still back in that lighthouse, standing face to face with the shadow. Despite her successful binding of the curse, she could feel its presence lingering within her. The locket, heavy against her chest, seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, and in the quiet moments, she could almost hear a faint whisper in the back of her mind, a dark, familiar voice calling her name. Determined to break free from its grip, Maya returned to Shadow Bay one last time, hoping to find closure, or at least some measure of peace. She visited Emma, who greeted her with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Maya," Emma said softly, embracing her. "You did it. The town. We're finally free. People are already beginning to feel the change." Maya forced a smile, but she couldn't ignore the cold weight pressing down on her. "Yes, the town is safe, but I feel like I'm still bound to it, like it's never truly left me." Emma's face grew serious, her gaze shifting to the locket. "The shadow marked you, Maya. You bear the weight of the curse now, even if it's no longer on the town. It's a heavy burden to carry, but it's one that can bring strength if you learn to wield it." Maya let her fingers brush over the locket, feeling its strange, almost living warmth. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that, Emma. Sometimes, I can feel it stirring. It's like it's waiting for me to slip, to let my guard down so it can take control." Emma placed a comforting hand on Maya's shoulder. "You've already proven your strength, Maya. You fought the shadow, faced it directly, and survived. That's something no one has ever done before. You have power over it now, even if it tries to haunt you." As Emma's words sank in, Maya felt a spark of hope. Perhaps she could learn to control the darkness within her, to channel it without letting it consume her. It would be a difficult path, but she was willing to try. That night, Maya stayed at the inn in Shadow Bay, lying awake in her room as the wind howled outside. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering in and out of her vision, and she felt the familiar chill creep over her. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, steadying herself against the pull of the shadow's presence. But just as she drifted into a fitful sleep, a dark, whispering voice echoed in her mind. "You may have bound me, Maya, but you will never be free. You carry me within you now, and I will wait, as long as it takes." Maya's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She sat up, clutching the locket, her body tense as the darkness loomed at the edges of her mind. She knew the shadow's words were true. She would never be fully free of it. But she also knew that she held the power to resist, to keep it contained. In the days that followed, she found herself drawn to the cliffs near the lighthouse, as if the shadow were calling her back. The townsfolk noticed her presence, whispering among themselves, some grateful, others wary. They could sense the change in her, the darkness she carried, and while they thanked her for saving the town, they couldn't quite meet her gaze, as if fearing what lay behind her eyes. As she stood at the cliff's edge, staring out at the vast, churning ocean, a familiar figure appeared beside her. It was Samuel Finch, the former lighthouse keeper, his face marked with the same haunted expression she now saw in her own reflection. "I thought I'd find you here," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. "I heard what you did. You saved us, Maya, but at a cost. I know what it's like to live with that darkness, that constant reminder of what lies beyond." Maya looked at him, seeing the same shadows in his eyes that she felt within herself. "I thought I was ready for this," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But now, it feels like it's a part of me. I don't know if I can keep it contained forever." Samuel nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "It'll never be easy, Maya. The shadow, it's relentless. It will try to wear you down, weaken you, and claim you as it did so many others. But you have something most of us never had." Maya raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" He looked her straight in the eyes, his expression resolute. "You have a choice. You don't have to face it alone. The people in this town, they owe you their lives, their freedom. You save them, and they'll stand by you if you let them. But you must choose to let them in, to share the weight of this burden." Maya thought about his words, the solitude she'd felt since leaving Shadow Bay, the feeling of carrying the curse alone. Perhaps Samuel was right. She didn't have to bear the shadow's mark alone. She could share her story, let the town understand the sacrifice she'd made, and maybe, just maybe, they would help her shoulder the burden. That evening, Maya gathered the townsfolk at the edge of the cliffs. She shared her story, telling them about her family's connection to the shadow, the ritual she'd performed, and the mark she now carried. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her chest, a release that eased the grip of the darkness within her. The people listened, their faces solemn, and when she finished, a quiet murmur of gratitude filled the air. They understood the sacrifice she'd made, the danger she still faced, and they vowed to support her however they could. Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose as she looked out at the faces of those she'd saved. She knew the shadow would always be a part of her, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beyond the cliffs of Shadow Bay. But now, she felt stronger, fortified by the support of the people she'd fought to protect. As she walked away from the cliffs, she felt the locket grow warm against her chest, a pulse of light that flickered within the darkness. She knew the shadow would wait, lurking at the edges of her mind, but she was no longer afraid. For the first time, she felt truly free, not of the shadow, but of the fear it had instilled within her. She had faced it, bound it, and though it remained a part of her, she now held the strength to keep it at bay. Shadow Bay was safe, and so was she, if only for now. Episode 9. The Ritual's Echo. Maya settled back into life in Shadow Bay, though everything felt different. The town, no longer cloaked in the oppressive weight of the shadow's curse, seemed brighter, almost alive. Children played on the streets without the wary glances of their parents, shops stayed open later, and the townsfolk greeted each other with cautious smiles, as if they, too, were learning to live again. But Maya's journey was far from over. Every night, she felt the shadow stirring within her, an echo of the darkness she'd confronted in the lighthouse. It was no longer a constant threat, but a presence she could feel at the edges of her mind, a silent reminder of the battle she'd fought and the legacy she carried. Emma continued to visit her, bringing old records and books filled with notes on local legends, folk remedies, and methods for warding off evil spirits. They spent hours poring over these texts, looking for anything that might help Maya manage the shadow's influence and prevent it from growing stronger. One evening, as they sat together in Emma's cozy living room, surrounded by stacks of ancient tomes, Emma's eyes lit up as she came across an old entry in a weathered book. "Listen to this," Emma said, her voice tinged with excitement. "It's a ritual passed down by the town's earliest settlers, meant to ground spirits and ward off the effects of dark forces. It says that those marked by darkness can balance their spirit by channeling their energy into symbols, creating a talisman of sorts." Maya leaned closer, her interest piqued. "A talisman? Do you think it would work for me?" Emma hesitated, her fingers brushing over the page as she read. "It's possible. The ritual involves creating a symbol that represents the bearer's inner strength, something that can anchor you when the shadow tries to take hold. It could be carved into wood, worn as a charm, or even etched into something you carry with you. The idea filled Maya with a glimmer of hope. A talisman might not free her from the shadow's influence, but it could give her a way to maintain control. Something to remind her of her own power, her connection to the town, and the strength she discovered within herself. She glanced at the locket around her neck, the only possession that had survived the ritual. It had become both a burden and a symbol of her courage. Perhaps if she inscribed a symbol into the locket, it could help her channel her energy, creating a balance between her will and the shadow's presence. After discussing the process with Emma, Maya spent the following days carving a simple yet powerful symbol into the back of the locket. It was a design that had come to her in a dream. A circle surrounding a small flame, representing the light she'd found within herself amidst the darkness. Once the carving was complete, she held the locket tightly, repeating the grounding words Emma had taught her, focusing on the symbol as an anchor, a reminder of her strength. At first, she felt nothing, but as the days passed, she began to notice subtle changes. The whispers in her mind grew fainter, the cold weight pressing down on her chest softened, and she felt a new sense of clarity, as if the talisman were amplifying her willpower, keeping the shadow's influence at bay. One evening, as she walked along the cliffs, Samuel appeared beside her, his face bearing the same haunted expression. "I heard about your talisman," he said, his voice low. "The people are talking. They say you've found a way to control the darkness." Maya looked at him, understanding the weight of his words. Samuel had been the town's lighthouse keeper, burdened by the shadow's presence for years, and yet he'd never been able to find peace. His face was lined with exhaustion, the same weariness she saw in her own reflection on sleepless nights. "It's not perfect," Maya admitted, "but it helps. It's like, it gives me a piece of myself back, a way to stand against it." Samuel's gaze softened. "You've done what no one else has managed, Maya. You've taken control of the darkness, even made it a part of you. Most would have been consumed by now." Maya turned to the ocean, watching the waves crash against the cliffs, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. She knew the shadow would always be with her, lingering in the edges of her mind. But now she had the strength to resist it. She'd reclaimed her own power, turning the legacy of her family's curse into a symbol of resilience. In the following weeks, she began to teach others in the town about the ritual and the symbols she'd carved into her locket. They listened eagerly, learning how to create their own talismans, not to keep away the shadow, but as a symbol of their own power and protection. For the first time in generations, Shadow Bay felt safe, no longer under the weight of its dark history. Maya continued her work as a protector of the town, but she did so not as someone controlled by the curse, but as someone who had reclaimed her own story. She became a leader, a guiding light for those who sought strength, just as the lighthouse had once been a beacon in the darkness. But every night, as she sat alone in her room, she would close her eyes and feel the locket against her chest, grounding her, reminding her of the darkness she had conquered. She knew the shadow would always be there, waiting, lurking at the edges of her mind. And yet, she no longer feared it. Episode 10, The Forgotten Light. The days turned into weeks, and Shadow Bay settled into a quiet, peaceful rhythm that had been unknown to its people for generations. The town was free from the curse, but its history remained alive in the memories of those who had survived its haunting presence. Maya, now a familiar face in every corner of Shadow Bay, had earned a quiet respect among the townspeople, who saw in her both a guardian and a reminder of the strength they'd found through their darkest trials. Each evening, as dusk descended, Maya would make her way up to the lighthouse. It had been shut down after the ritual, the townspeople reluctant to revisit the memories of the shadow's hauntings. But Maya had decided to reopen it, knowing that its light was a symbol of hope and resilience for the town. The lighthouse was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of renewal, a beacon for all who had weathered the storms of the past. Inside, she had transformed the observation room into a small sanctuary. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books about Shadow Bay's history, Amelia's journal, and even her own notes about the ritual and the talisman she now wore. It was a quiet tribute to her great-grandmother and all those who had tried to protect the town before her. One evening, As she climbed the spiral staircase to the observation room, Maya felt the familiar weight of the locket against her chest, a constant reminder of the shadow's presence. But tonight, as she reached the top and looked out over the ocean, she felt a strange calm, a feeling that she was finally at peace with her past, her family, and the curse that had once held her captive. The lighthouse's light swept across the cliffs, illuminating the dark waves crashing against the shore below. Maya closed her eyes, allowing the ocean's rhythm to ground her, to remind her of everything she had overcome. She had become more than just a protector of Shadow Bay. She had become a part of its history, its legacy. Suddenly, she felt a faint, familiar chill, and a whisper brushed against her mind, faint but distinct. "Maya." The voice was soft, less menacing than before. She held the locket tightly, opening her mind to the presence she sensed there, the echo of the shadow's voice. But instead of the terror it had once instilled in her, she felt only a gentle pull, a whisper of recognition. "You are not my enemy, Maya," the voice murmured, sounding almost grateful. "You have freed me, bound me, and in doing so, you have brought peace to this place." Maya's pulse quickened, but she felt no fear. She understood, now, that the shadow was no longer a threat. It had become something different, transformed by her will and by the power of the talisman she'd created. "Then go," she whispered softly, feeling a strange warmth spreading through her. "Go and find rest. Shadow Bay is free now." The whisper faded, the presence within her mind retreating like a wave pulled back into the ocean. She felt a strange sense of finality, as if a door had quietly closed, leaving her alone in the silence of the lighthouse. She opened her eyes, gazing out over the town below, feeling the weight of the locket grow lighter against her chest. It was as though the shadow's essence had been released, leaving only a quiet peace, a final echo that settled within her like a memory, a reminder of the courage and resilience she'd found in herself. The next day, she walked through the town with a renewed sense of purpose. People greeted her warmly, thanking her with genuine smiles and grateful nods. Children ran past her, laughing and playing, their joy unburdened by the darkness that had once plagued the town. In the following weeks, she continued her work, helping to restore Shadow Bay's history and preserving its stories. She recorded everything she knew about the curse, the rituals, and her family's legacy in a new book, a testament to the courage of the people who had endured the darkness and reclaimed their lives. On her final night in Shadow Bay, Maya returned to the cliffs one last time, her gaze fixed on the lighthouse as its beams swept across the horizon. She felt a sense of completion, as though her journey had come full circle, and she was ready to leave, to let Shadow Bay move forward into a future free from the shadows of the past. The people gathered to see her off, their faces filled with gratitude and respect. Emma embraced her, tears in her eyes. "You gave us our freedom, Maya. I don't think any of us will ever forget what you've done." Maya smiled, her heart full. "I didn't do it alone. This town's strength runs deep. You've all faced your fears and reclaimed your lives. You don't need me here to keep Shadow Bay safe. You're stronger than you realize." With a final wave, Maya turned and walked down the path, her heart light. The locket hung around her neck, still bearing the symbol she had carved, a reminder of everything she had fought for. But now, it felt like a piece of her past, a memory she would carry with pride rather than burden. As she left Shadow Bay behind, Maya felt a sense of peace settle within her. She had faced her family's curse, reclaimed her strength, and found a way to bring light to the town that had once been haunted by darkness. And as the lighthouse's beam disappeared behind her, she knew that Shadow Bay would never again be a place of fear. It would be a place of resilience, a place of forgotten light reclaimed.